for joining me today. We are going to wrap up our journey through 1st and 2nd Kings this week and take a look at the end of 2nd Kings. Let's go ahead and pray as we get started. God, we just come to you today and we thank you for your word. We thank you for the journey that we've had through 1st and 2nd Kings. I pray that as we look here at the end of 2nd Kings, that you will speak to our hearts and you will transform us by these words and by just your work in our lives, God. We love you and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So last week we studied Hezekiah and we left at the end of his reign and we in chapter 20 and we had seen all of the different things that he did that were good, how he stood up and trusted God to save them from the Assyrians. And we see God intervening on behalf of his people in Judah. And that's where we ended things with Hezekiah. And so all the good that he did, because Hezekiah was considered to be a good king, all the good that he did, though, didn't even last for another king. His son Manasseh took the throne when Manasseh was 12 years old. This is what happens in chapter 21. And he pretty much wipes out everything that Hezekiah had done that was good in just a very short period of time. So in verse 2, it says, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole as King Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. In the 2 courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. And keeps going on and on with all of the things that he does to desecrate the temple and desecrate worship of God. So Manasseh did a lot of terrible things. We find out later in this chapter, in verse 16, that he shed the blood. It says he shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. And we learn kind of in the middle, around verses 9 and 10, it says the people didn't listen and Manasseh led them astray. So they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. And it says that Manasseh committed detestable sins and has done more evil than the Amorites who preceded him and has led Judah into sin with his idols. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I'm going to bring disaster on Jerusalem and Judah, that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. And he says that he's going to wipe out Jerusalem and forsake the remnant of his inheritance and give them into the hands of enemies. They'll be looted and plundered. And so all of these things is what God is saying is going to happen as a result of all of the sin that has been building up. But then Manasseh kind of pushes it over the edge and just does all of the detestable things. He follows all the ways of the kings of Israel and follows all the ways of the people who were driven out of the land before the people came into it, back in the time of Joshua. So in the span of 55 years, Manasseh undoes everything that Hezekiah had set right. And then we find out that the next king of Judah, Amon, follows right in his father's footsteps. He only ruled for 2 years, but he also does evil in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father and worshipped idols and all of those things and did not listen. But he only reigned for 2 years and he was assassinated. And then finally, we get to chapter 22 and we have a new king, Josiah. We learn at the very beginning of chapter 22 that Josiah became king when he was 8 years old and he ruled for 31 years. And this would have been about 640 to 609 BC. And we learn immediately in verse 2 that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And he followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or the left. So we learn immediately that Josiah is a devout king. His heart is turned to God. He has that heart that is a listening heart, and he truly desires to follow God, and he doesn't turn to the right or the left. And so what is it for a devout king and devout worshiper of God to do but to reform? He wants to repair the temple. There's been a lot of back and forth with lots of different kings and different practices and tearing down different forms of worship and erecting others, and he wants to repair the temple. So it would have been a very old temple by this time, and wants to do some repairs. We're not really told exactly what he's wanting to repair, because the focus of this is not going to be that he's repairing the temple, as it was several kings ago when we talked about Joash back several chapters back. So Josiah gives instructions, hey, we need to repair the temple, and in that process, Hilkiah the high priest comes to Shaphan the secretary and says, I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. And he's discovered this, and this is now going to be the central theme of chapter 22. And I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit of this, because our curriculum this week really zeroes in on this section in chapter 22. We're going to talk about 22 and 23, but I do want to read several sections here. I'm going to start reading here in 2 Kings 22, verse 8. Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. He gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan the secretary went to the king and reported to him, your officials have paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord and have entrusted it to the workers and supervisors at the temple. Then Shaphan the secretary informed the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's attendant. Go and inquire of the Lord for me, and for the people, and for all Judah, about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us. Now just imagine with me for a minute. So here's Josiah, and we're not told exactly how old he is at this point. It says the 18th year of his reign, but he still wouldn't have been super old, because remember, he started ruling when he was around the age of 8. And so here he is, and he has seen all of the ways that the people have been practicing worship and worshiping idols and all of the things that have been going on. And he wants to repair the temple. And they find this book that he's never heard from, never read, never experienced. And they bring it and they read parts of it to him. And a lot of scholars think that perhaps this was maybe the book of Deuteronomy. And but we're not told exactly. And there's some different reasons why scholars think that. And we're not going to go into here. But whatever it was, book of Deuteronomy, let's just go with that for a minute. You remember we've read in Deuteronomy 28, we referred back there a couple of times in our study over the summer. And the chapter 28 of Deuteronomy goes through the blessings for obedience to the covenant and for fulfilling the covenant. What do they get if that happens? But it also goes through the curses. And we've read through there. There's some stuff in there. You don't want that to happen. So can you imagine being Josiah and hearing, and this isn't the only place you hear that kind of thing spelled out, but can you imagine being Josiah and hearing these words of, hey, this is what you're supposed to do to worship God and to follow him. And here's what's going to happen if you do it. And here's what's going to happen if you don't. Can you imagine how he would have felt? I can imagine just the horror. I mean, we are told that he tears his robes and that he is just beside himself. And tearing his robes is a sign of mourning. So he is just completely distraught over what he has heard. And we're told he has this realization that God's anger is burning against them because they've not been upholding what it says in this book of the law. And so he is just beside himself. And so he does the only thing he can think to do, which is, well, I realize this is terrible, so I'm going to go and inquire of the Lord. And so he sends a delegation to go and speak to a prophet. So let's pick up reading in verse 14. Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to speak to the prophet Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, the son of Haras, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the new quarter. She said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me. This is what the Lord says. I'm going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and aroused my anger by all the idols their hands have made, my anger will burn against this place and will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become a curse and be laid waste. And because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore, I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring on this place." So they took her answer back to the king. So the first thing perhaps that I notice about this passage is that the prophet is a woman. Huldah is her name, and she's identified by who her husband is, and he was the keeper of the wardrobe. We're not really told, was it the wardrobe in the palace, wardrobe in the temple? We're not told. And that she lived in the new quarter in Jerusalem, and this new quarter would have been a northern extension of Jerusalem. So she was nearby. They didn't have to go very far to inquire of her. It's so interesting to me because we don't have a ton of women prophets in the Bible, but we do have some, and Huldah is one of them. And so she gives them this message. And the message is definitely not what Josiah would have been hoping for. It's exactly what he feared and had read in or heard in this book of the law. No, God is definitely angry, and he is going to judge his people. In fact, it's even worse than perhaps he had hoped, in that his anger, they've forsaken him and burned incense to other gods and aroused his anger. But his anger is not going to be quenched. Like, it's not going to end. And that's a little bit of a different thing because than what we have seen in the past, because there's been so many points in our study of 1st and 2nd Kings where God will say, "But I will preserve them because of my servant David, my covenant with David. I'm going to preserve the people." But this time is saying, my anger will not be quenched. There is going to be judgment enacted. And so the delegation goes back and reports, though, that so God is saying this is what's going to happen. Judgment is in fact coming. But because you are humble, because your heart is responsive. I love that, what it says in verse 19. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord, then you are not going to experience this judgment. You will go ahead and pass on, and then that judgment's going to come later. You're not going to be alive to experience it. You're not going to see the disaster. And so this is the message they bring back to King Josiah. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know that I would have felt a whole lot better about this message if I were Josiah. I mean, he's the king of a nation. And a good king is going to want the kingdom to continue beyond him and for his people to not suffer in any way. And so what he's hearing here is, well, it's going to be okay while you're alive and while you are the king. But after you have already passed away and another king is going to come, then this judgment's coming. This disaster is going to be carried out. And I can't imagine he's feeling super excited about that or good about that. Maybe he feels a little bit relieved that he's not going to necessarily have to deal with it. But I don't know that I would feel that much better. So what is Josiah going to do? How is he going to respond this time? And this is where we get to chapter 23. And we're not going to read every bit of chapter 23 because there's a lot in it. But this is where his reforms are going to come in. So he hears this message of, well, destruction is still going to come. There's still going to be judgment. But his heart is so attuned to following God wholeheartedly. So if we were to look back at Deuteronomy 6, and we look at some of the commands that are listed here. These are the commands, in 6:1. These are the commands and decrees and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. So then he goes on and he says, Hear, O Israel, this is in verse 4. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These are the commandments that I give you today, and they are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. And it goes on. But thinking about Josiah and how he is responding this way to God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all of your strength. So let's see what the first thing is that Josiah does. So I'm going to read 23, starting in verse 1. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord and keep his commands, statutes, and decrees with all his heart and all his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in this book. Then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. And we hear those words, heart and soul, come back up here. And we see Josiah standing in this covenant renewal ceremony. He is the stand-in for the people. So all of the people he's just the representative. And coming in, and he is renewing the covenant with the Lord. Even though judgment and destruction are coming, he still wants to renew this covenant. And now we hear it being called the Book of the Covenant. So they've given it a different name, the Book of the Law. It's just the idea of renewing this covenant with the Lord. And we have this covenant renewal ceremony that takes place. And then what follows these verses here, starting in verse 4 and going on through most of the rest of the chapter, is all of the reforms that Josiah does. He doesn't just stop at renewing the covenant. He responds with extensive reforms that extend well beyond the boundaries of Judah. So he goes and he starts doing all these reforms because it's right. It's the right thing to do. It doesn't matter if God's going to relent of his anger and the judgment to come, if that's even a possibility. Because at this point, it's uncertain. Josiah is probably uncertain at best, and it definitely seems unlikely at worst that God is going to relent, because the message says that his anger will not be quenched. But Josiah does it anyways. He does these reforms anyways, because he is living out loving God with all of his heart, all his soul, and his strength. And he goes through and he reforms all of the religious practices that were not focused on the one true God, and that were outside of Jerusalem, that were happening in other places. So he goes and it starts in the temple. And we have just this rapid succession. There were a lot of his reforms were brutal, and they were total, meaning they were very complete in a lot of ways. So he comes in and he gets rid of all of the idols that have been placed in the temple. The articles that were made for Baal and the Asherah pole and the star, all the ones, the worshiping of the hosts of heaven, so like the stars and the moon and the sun, all of those things. And he gets rid of all of them. He burns all of these things outside in the Kidron Valley. And he got rid of the priests, and he gets rid of all sorts of other things. And so this reform is going to start in the temple and then spread outward. He's going to tear down all of the high places. He desecrates all of these places as well. So if you look through this chapter, and I encourage you to read chapter 23, because we're really not going to have time to read all of it. But to read it, I'm going to look at my notes for a second, because there are a lot of very strong verbs that describe Josiah's actions. So he's described as burning, grinding to dust, tearing down, destroying, smashing, removing, slaughtering, throwing away, defiling, and cutting down, think about all of these different words that are describing his reforms. So it is a complete reform. If we look down in verse 15, I mentioned that it goes beyond the boundaries of Judah. It says, even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he demolished. He burned the high place and ground it to powder and burned the Asherah pole also. So he would go through and he would do all of these things and destroy these high places and these idols and all of these things. And then they would desecrate these places by burning human bones on them, which sounds terrible and disgusting. But it would desecrate them and render them unusable. And so we have that happening here as well. But he extends his reforms to Bethel and gets rid of that golden calf and that high place that was set up there by Jeroboam. And if we go back and look at 1 Kings 13, this is the prophecy that is given about Josiah to Jeroboam. It says a son, so this is 1 Kings 13, verse 2. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who make offerings here, and her human bones will be burned on you. And that is the prophecy that the man of God from Judah, which that was an interesting story in and of itself, gives to Jeroboam about what is going to happen at Bethel. But it's quite a bit before Josiah is on the scene. So Josiah is fulfilling that prophecy. Then we see in verse 21, they celebrate Passover. And it is the first Passover that is celebrated in a while, and the only one that, since the Judges, that has been celebrated this way at a central location. Josiah got rid of all of the mediums and the spiritists and all of the idols and household gods, all of the things that he did. He got rid of all of those things, completely eradicated them, and reformed every aspect of worship for the people. And I think one of the things that is so surprising about Josiah's reforms is that they didn't have to happen, in the sense of there was no automatic, hey, if you do all this, God's not going to be angry and he's not going to judge and this destruction's not going to come. There was none of that. In fact, it was the opposite. There was no hint that God would relent at all. I mean, Huldah's message said that. That's what Josiah had read or heard read in the book of the covenant when they found it. But he reforms anyways. And I think that's why whenever we read through this and we look at what he did, I think that is why Deuteronomy 6 comes up, and we think about these words of loving God with all of our hearts, with all of our soul, and all of our minds, and how his reform and his desire to do that had nothing to do with what God was going to do for him. It had everything to do with loving God because doing it because it was the right thing to do, and to uphold the covenant in that way. If we look at 2 Kings 23, verse 25, it says this: neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all of his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, in accordance with the law of Moses. Nevertheless, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger, which burned against Judah, because of all that Manasseh had done to arouse his anger. So we see that Josiah did, in fact, love God. He did those things because he loved God with everything that he had, with all parts of himself, and with every fiber of his being. And even though he did that, God did not relent in the judgment that was coming. What was enacted, what was going to happen, was already going to happen. But Josiah loved God anyways, and he did what was right anyways. And I think it's just so beautiful, because so much of the time I think that it can be easy to get caught up in loving God because of what he does for us. But then that means that if God doesn't do what I want, if God doesn't provide healing when I want it, or provide success, or provide whatever, you name it, fill in the blank, then do I really love God? If my love is based only on what he does for us. But if we, looking at Josiah's example, base our love of God on who he is, on the fact that he is one who's deserving of our love. And that he is God, he is the king, and that we get to have a relationship with him, and that we get to be with him. And so that's what loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, all our soul, and our mind, loving him with everything we have, not because he does stuff for us, but because he's God and we love him. And I think that Josiah exemplifies that really well. I think it's such a reflective question for me to think through, and I hope that you'll take time to think about it too. Do I love God because of who God is, or because of what God does for me? And sure, God has done lots for us. I mean, sending Jesus to die for us and all of those things. And we should love those things that God does for us, and we should thank him for those things. But our basis of our love for God should be on who he is, because he's deserving of our love and our praise. And that is rock solid in the sense of that's not something that's shakeable. If things are going poorly or if things are going well, we can love God in all of those seasons. And I think it can be tied really closely to being just unshakable and unwavering in our faith and in our hope and our trust in God, is that it's not based on if he's giving me what I want, but he is with me and we have a relationship and we can be together. That is what it should be rooted in, and not in what he's doing for me. So from this point, Josiah is really our last good king, because the end is coming, and it's coming quickly. After Josiah, there are several more kings, and it gets a little bit crazy, because you've got King Jehoahaz, and you have Jehoiakim, and Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah, and there's Babylon coming in and attacking, and there's the first deportation, where we talked about that with Ezekiel, and then there is the final one that happens when Jerusalem falls to Babylon. And that is how this whole volume, 1st and 2nd Kings, wraps up, is that the people of Judah are carted off to Babylon in exile. And we are left in a very different world. And it comes so fast on the heels of Josiah, because the end starts almost immediately after Josiah dies. So it's not a ton of time that passes. It's really only about 30-ish years between the end of Josiah's reign and the fall of Jerusalem. So it's not that much time that passes. So all of those reforms couldn't prevent the exile. But Josiah was faithful to God nonetheless. I think there's a lot in there for us to learn from Josiah's example. Well, I hope that you've really enjoyed this study of 1st and 2nd Kings. I know it's been fascinating for me. I'm really excited about what we're doing next. We're going to be studying some of the minor prophets and going through those texts and seeing what God has to say to us through more prophets, which it's been very interesting because I've already started reading, and just reading that right on the heels of 1st and 2nd Kings is fascinating, because we get more of the warnings and more of, hey, this is what's going to happen, and a little bit more of that history. So it ties together very nicely. So that's what we're going to spend our fall doing. So I hope you'll join me again next week when we'll kick things off. Bye!